Dr. Mehler coming at you with more bad news. This time we're taking a look at chapter 20, which is the 1920s up to the Great Depression. And I just wanted to give you a little introduction to it. I'm going to share my screen and say a few words about the chapter. There is nothing fancy this week. There's no added videos and things. This is to just have the straightforward. It should be a straightforward week. Can't believe we're at week 6 already. This is from business culture to the Great Depression, the 20s, 1920 to 1932. And often we think of this as the Roaring 20s. The 1920s were a period of tremendous enthusiasm and excitement and expansion and technological innovation. But it is also a period that had really serious problems which ended with the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was an enormous shock. This was a global depression. The first thing I want to make clear about this is that the Great Depression did not happen in the United States. The Great Depression, first of all, the big banks of Austria and Europe collapsed first. The Great Depression came to France later, but the Great Depression was a global collapse of the global capitalist system, and it marked a point at which the capitalist system might have collapsed. There were two other competing systems with capitalism. One was communism, which didn't collapse in the middle of this, and people were astonished that it didn't collapse. And there was fascism, which was another system. Adolf Hitler was in the 1930s. Became Chancellor of Germany, and with a autocratic dictatorial system, Germany was able to pull itself seemingly out of the Depression, whereas the United States and the other democratic nations of the world were still struggling. In fact, democracies were collapsing all over the world, and in the United States, it really was a serious question as to whether democracy would survive here too. Millions and millions of Americans thought that the situation was so miserable that I would rather have either a communist government or a fascist government and have employment than have the situation where the government wasn't doing anything. So with that, let me just first take a look at the introduction. They give you a little outline of what the period looked like. It started in 1915. They start off with the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. The 1920s was a period when this is the second Klan. The first Ku Klux Klan emerged in 1870 after the Civil War, and it was only in the South, and it was made up of ex-Southern Confederate soldiers whose goal, they were an armed part of the Democratic Party of the South, and their goal was to drive the Republicans out of the South and to return the South to home rule, that is to white supremacist governments. The South after the Civil War was a marvelous experiment in multiracial democracy. And the difference was that after the Civil War, citizenship was defined by anyone who was born in the United States or naturalized as a citizen of the United States, but primarily we're talking about anyone who's born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. So it doesn't matter whether you're Chinese, Japanese, African American, Jewish, Catholic, it just doesn't matter. If you're born in the United States, you're a citizen. So citizenship is dependent upon one factor alone, and that is that you were born in the United States. You don't have to speak English, you don't have to believe in any kind of values. You're a citizen of this country if you were born in this country. However, that really didn't take hold. What you had instead was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, of 100% Americanism in the 1920s, and a campaign of terror against not only African Americans, but the second Klan. The first Klan, by the way, was really destroyed by efforts by the government, repression, anti-Klan laws, and anti-masking laws, that you couldn't go around with a mask over your head. And so it was gone. There just was no Ku Klux Klan. And in 1915, a blockbuster movie was created by D.W. Griffith. You can watch it on YouTube. It's available. It's called Birth of a Nation. It's an hour plus, an hour and 15, hour and a half silent movie, a really long silent movie. And it was just an incredible blockbuster at the time. Made a fortune, ran in movie theaters until the middle of the 1940s, 1950s. And Woodrow Wilson reviewed it while he was president of the United States, and he said it's like history written with lightning. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court screened it privately and said that he was proud that in his youth he had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So this was a period of the second Klan. This second Klan wasn't focused on the South, and it wasn't focused on returning home rule, and it wasn't focused on Democrats getting Republicans out of the South. This was a Ku Klux Klan that was, for example, one of the most powerful organizations, the largest organization in Indiana history, and they controlled the Republican Party of Indiana. So this was a plan that appealed to both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It was in both the North and the South, and it was not aimed exclusively at African Americans. Here in Michigan, the Klan kept in Owego. They had a list of all the Catholics in this area. So the Klan was active in the North, it was active in the South, and it was anti-Catholic, it was anti-Jewish. There was a lynching of Leo Frank, a famous lynching in the South of a Jewish businessman accused of raping a Christian girl. So this is the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. The 1920s was a period of intense racism in the United States. Then the American Civil Liberties Union was established, the ACLU to fight for civil rights. Sacco and Vanzetti, trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, 1921. Sacco and Vanzetti were two immigrants. They were anarchists, and there was a bombing in Chicago. They were accused of it. The evidence was kind of iffy, and they were sentenced to death, and it became a cause célèbre among the left in the United States. The Naval Arms Conference has to do with the rise of naval power. This is like the arms race later on. This is, the Japanese are building a navy, the British are building a navy, the Germans are building a navy, the Americans are building a navy. And so we had a conference that decided the ratio of navies in the world. So we would have limited arms development. The Hays Codes is these were codes that did not allow cowboys to curse. So you'll find all the old movies. There's a very strict code of language and behavior and what could be shown, and these were adapted for all of Hollywood movies. The Immigration Act of 1924. My dissertation was all about this. Really, I spent a lot of time working on the eugenics movement and the immigration. This was really the first time that America restricted immigration across the board based on racial groupings. And so from 1924 to 1965, the immigration laws in the United States favored people from Germany, France, England, Scandinavia, etc., and made it very difficult for anyone from Russia, Italy, Yugoslavia, from Eastern Europe, or of course from Asia and Latin America. So the Immigration Act of 1924 restricted American immigration. The Scopes trial was the famous trial of a high school teacher who was teaching evolution in high school, and that I believe this was also Indiana, and he lost, but it was not really a victory for the right-wing forces. William Jennings Bryan defended the state law and asserted that everything in the Bible was absolutely true, and got all caught up when he was interrogated and asked about Jonah and the whale and all these other things. And so it really, while it was technically a victory for the anti-science camp, it really was a victory for evolution and the development of the ability to teach modern science in schools, public schools. Charles Lindbergh flies nonstop across the Atlantic. This was, it was like the moon launch. It was like the moon landing. I mean, everybody it was breathtaking, and he left New Jersey when he was over in the Atlantic Ocean. There were no reports. I mean, he was just gone, and people were, is he going to arrive? Is he going to make it? Is he going to make it? Because, Amelia Earhart just disappeared. You could just disappear. And when he finally emerged over Europe, and they saw his plane coming and landing in Paris, it was this like stunning accomplishment. It was like landing the man on the moon. It was just, and then he came back to the United States, a big ticker tape parade, and became one of the most famous people in the world. And he was a friend of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Luftwaffe, and he was a eugenist who campaigned for the Immigration Act of 1924. Sacco and Vanzetti executed in 1927. The Shepard-Towner Act is repealed. So the Shepard-Towner Act was passed to as part of the maternity rights. It was like it created benefits for mothers and children, and it was repealed in 1929 because after women got the right to vote, the government felt that women no longer needed special help. They had all the rights of men. They could work just as long hours as men with as few as the wages, etc. So protections that had been afforded to women under the Shepard-Towner Act were repealed in 1929. It stepped back. And 1929 is the time when the stock market collapses. And the stock market collapse is a nice moment in which you can say the Great Depression began in the United States. But even there, the Great Depression begins for farmers in the United States in the 1920s, early 1920s. I'll talk a little bit more about the Great Depression in a minute. Okay, now actually this would be a good place to do it, and Smoot Hawley will come in at the end. So let me stop the share and just talk a little bit now to you and me, a few words about the Great Depression and why it was great, and what was great about it, and what was going on. First, the Great Depression really began right here in Michigan. I want you to know the governor of Michigan, I believe it was in early 1932, uh, uh, shut down all the banks in Michigan by executive order. General Motors and Ford Motor Company found themselves with huge inventories of cars that they couldn't sell. And so they shut down their factories, sent all their workers home until they could sell off the inventory, and they needed more cars, and they would make more cars. So there was this strange thing that was going on. You had the River Rouge factory, the largest factory in the world, and it was in perfectly good shape. All the things that you needed to make cars were right there. You had all this steel and all the coal and all the machinery. The workers were right outside the factory door, and they were ready to go to work, and they wanted to go to work, and they wanted to make cars. There was only one problem. Nobody could afford to buy a car. And what had happened, which according to John Maynard Keynes, this is a guy, an economist, a British guy, who said, let me try to explain what's happened here. Henry Ford and the other industrialists were busy improving manufacturing techniques and the technology of manufacturing, while at the same time cutting wages. So the workers were no longer able to buy the cars that were being manufactured. What he called this was a collapse of aggregate demand. Recently, in the pandemic, the federal government loosened up the strings and started giving everybody unemployment and all kinds of benefits flowed from the federal government, and that increased demand and kept the economy afloat. The opposite was happening here. Demand was collapsing. Nobody had any money to buy anything. And so, and it was a spiral. So once you have this collapse of aggregate demand, once you have a population, a working population that can't afford to buy stuff, you have a collapsed economy, and you've got to get things moving again somehow. But Herbert Hoover came from a world in which the government that governs least governs best. That and in fact, in the text, he says, he quotes from a previous president who said that it's the obligation of the people to support the government. It's not the government's obligation to support the people. So it's hard for, with that kind of mentality, to respond to what was going on. But millions and millions of people were on the streets, and it looked like the whole system was about to collapse, and the world was collapsing all around us. And so in response, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. That is, what we wanted to do was protect our own industries. So we slapped very high taxes on imports, and that meant that all the other countries of the world retaliated, and that brought international trade virtually to a halt. There's one other thing that was important that happened. Up until, I believe it was 1929, the United States came out of World War I. The wealthy, wealthier than everybody. We hadn't been destroyed, and the British and the French had borrowed enormous amounts of money from the United States during the war in order to fight the war, and they owed us that money. They needed to start paying us back. After World War I, everybody blamed the Germans for the war, and so the Germans were saddled with astronomical reparations payments that they had to make to France and England. So the way it worked was the United States lent Germany money which they could use then to pay back their loans, their debt to England and France. And since England and France owed the United States, so Germany would pay the money to England and France, and England and France would pay what they owed to the United States. And the United States would take that money and lend it to Germany, who would pay their reparations payments to England and France, and then England and France would pay what they owed to the United States, and the United States would send the money to Germany, and from Germany it went to England and France, and from England and France it went to the United States, and it was going around and around. With the onset of the Great Depression, the American administration said, look, we can't do that anymore, and they suspended payments to Germany. Immediately, the Germans suspended payments to the British and the French because they just couldn't do it. In fact, what was happening in Germany, since there was demand for them to make these payments, the only way they could do it would be to print enormous amounts of currency, and the German mark, the dollar, German dollar. Imagine today. I'll give you an idea of what it would look like if today we had the kind of hyperinflation. It's called hyperinflation. And remember, from 1800 to 1900, there was no inflation at all. We didn't have inflation. Inflation is not something that people lived with as a course of their lives. You and I have grown up in a world in which there's nothing but inflation. The dollar buys less and less and less. So sometimes, like computer equipment, things can get really vastly cheaper. But in general, what we're talking about is it takes more dollars to buy the same product. Every year, every decade, sometimes inflation is higher than others, and when inflation gets really high, we worry about it because prices change a lot and things get higher and people notice it, and they have a hard time buying stuff with the money that they're earning. So you have a situation where the banks are collapsing, Wall Street is collapsing, there's enormous unemployment. And after Detroit shuts down, the governor of Detroit closes the banks because there's a run on the banks. And by the way, at this time, if you had money in the bank and the bank went under, you lost all your money. That's there was no protection for that. So I was going to give you an example of hyperinflation. So imagine that prices started going up, and a six-pack of beer was $6,000, and the next week it was $12,000, and the week after that it was $24,000 for a pack of beer. So I have a retirement account. I'm 75. Should have been retired a long time ago, but here I am still working, and so I retire. And now I take my entire retirement account and I cash it in and run out and buy myself a pack of beer. And that's it. It's gone. Because prices have gone from $2 or $3 for a pack of beer to $3,000, $30,000, $90,000. We're talking about just the money. It took in Germany barrels of paper, because the money, a postage stamp cost 3 million marks. That's hyperinflation. And by the way, hyperinflation has happened a number of times historically, and it happened recently in Venezuela. They had a hyperinflation of several thousand % a few years ago. It wreaks havoc on an economy. And you might want to consider the fact that we have, in Venezuela, you have a country that has enormous oil reserves. In Iraq, you have a country with enormous oil reserves. In Syria, you have a country with enormous oil reserves. And all those countries are in total depression and despair. They are dysfunctional, and there's no money. And you wonder, well, but they have, like, they're sitting on liquid gold. How is it they could be in this situation? And there's an irony. It's called the curse of resources, where if you, normally you think that if they discover oil in my backyard, boy, hey, I'm happy because I'm going to be a millionaire. Not if you're a Native American, because if you're a Native American and they discover anything in your backyard to value, it means that you're going to get kicked off in order for the white people to come in and take your land and get the stuff that's really valuable. And that's what happens a lot around the world with countries that have enormously valuable resources. The people who live right next to the enormously valuable resources simply get screwed. So that's hyperinflation. Now, so the governor of Michigan closed the banks of Michigan, and the next thing we have is the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States and Adolf Hitler in Germany. In the United States, one of the first things that Franklin Delano Roosevelt does is he closes all the banks in the country. But the transition, that's for next week. This is a transition from Herbert Hoover, who believed the old way, that governments should not support the people. He didn't believe in direct welfare payments, to a new way of thinking, which is new for us, but it was old for the rest of the world. England, France, Germany, Italy, all those countries were already established as what we call welfare capitalism, welfare states. That is, those countries were already accepted the idea that the government has, to take care of its citizens, make sure that people have health care, for example, make sure that education is funded, make sure that pregnant women have health care, that they have time off to take care of your babies. When you're old, that you can afford to live out the rest of your life with some kind of dignity, and the government was responsible for these kinds of things. And so the government put together programs to take care of citizens. So the British government took care of British citizens, and the German government took care of German citizens. There are all kinds of welfare systems that didn't exist in the United States. So that, for example, universal health care was a crazy idea, but not in Germany. Germany already had universal health care. Britain would create a national health system after World War II, but they were already well on their way to having a welfare state. The government owned and ran certain crucial industries, for example, like coal mining in Britain. It was run by the government, so that in time of war, the government would always have coal, and that there was enough coal for everybody to go around and keep people warm and burn things in for factories. So it's like later on, you have the airlines. So you have Air France. Air France was an airline that was run by the French government. In the United States, you didn't have Air America run by the United States government. We did do those kinds of things. And so this is a real important transition point in American history to the idea that the government ought to be responsible for the welfare of its citizens. That idea is not going to sit well with another idea, which will become prominent, you'll see later on, that the government really, that anything that can be done by private business is done more efficiently and better than the government can do. The government is the problem, as Ronald Reagan said, not the solution for our problems. So that is, let me get back, I'll share the screen, because there was these last things that here. So the Smooth Holy Fire, and then the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was established. Okay, so this was the first break. I mean, even Hoover recognized that government had to do something, and so the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was a government corporation established to help private banks and railroads and other big industries by lending them money and supporting their loans. The Bonus March on Washington was a group of World War I veterans who marched on Washington demanding bonus checks. They had been promised bonus checks, but the bonus checks weren't going to be delivered until 1940 something. And, that was ridiculous. It's so far away. Here we were in the midst of this depression. Why didn't the government just hand out the bonus check to the veterans? And instead, Hoover ordered the military to disperse the veterans, and they used gas and machine guns, and people got killed, and it was a disaster for Herbert Hoover. All around the country, there were unemployed people who were homeless, and now were living in shanties that they called Hoovervilles. So that 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 the coming election, Herbert Hoover was going to lose no matter who the Democrats chose. I mean, if Mickey Mouse ran on the Democratic platform, Mickey Mouse would have been the president in 1932. All right, so that's the chapter, and that's the week. I'll leave it there, and I'll see you in class next week for those of you who want to come, and we'll keep on keeping on.